You think you know yourself, but you don't. Most people live their entire lives as strangers to themselves, completely unaware of the emotional forces driving every decision they make. They react instead of respond, get triggered by the same situations over and over, and wonder why they keep ending up in the same cycles of frustration, anxiety, and disappointment. Here's the brutal truth. If you don't understand your own emotional patterns, you're not in control of your life. Your emotions are. And until you develop true emotional intelligence, you'll continue to be a passenger in your own existence, wondering why success feels so elusive and why your relationships never seem to reach their full potential. This isn't another feel-good self-help video about positive thinking. This is about the hard science of emotional intelligence and the practical systems you need to finally understand yourself at a deep level. By the time you finish this video, you'll have a complete framework for emotional self-mastery that most people will never discover. But here's what separates you from the 99% who will never change. You're here, you're listening, and you're about to learn something that will fundamentally alter how you operate in the world. Let's begin. Chapter 1: The Emotional Ignorance Epidemic. The average person experiences over 27,000 emotions per day. Yet, they can only identify and name about 12 of them accurately. Think about that for a moment. You're experiencing a constant stream of emotional data that could guide every decision you make, help you understand your deepest motivations, and show you exactly what you need to thrive. But you're functionally blind to 99% of it. This isn't just unfortunate, it's devastating to your potential. Emotional ignorance is the silent killer of human achievement. It's why intelligent people make terrible decisions, why capable individuals sabotage their own success, and why people with every advantage still struggle to create the life they want. The problem starts early. Our education system teaches us algebra, but not how to recognize when we're overwhelmed. We learn about the Revolutionary War, but not how to identify the difference between fear and excitement in our bodies. We memorize the periodic table, but we have no systematic understanding of our own emotional periodic table. By the time we reach adulthood, we're emotional illiterates. Navigating an emotionally complex world, we use primitive coping mechanisms we developed as children to handle sophisticated adult challenges. We project our unresolved emotional patterns onto every relationship and situation we encounter. We make career decisions based on unconscious fears, relationship choices based on unexamined needs, and life decisions based on emotional patterns we don't even know we have. The cost of this ignorance is staggering. Emotionally unaware, people consistently underperform their potential. They experience higher levels of stress, anxiety, and depression. Their relationships are more volatile and less satisfying. They make impulsive decisions that derail their progress. They struggle with consistency because they don't understand their own motivational patterns. But the most tragic cost is this: they never become who they're truly capable of being. They live their entire lives as a diminished version of themselves, held back not by external circumstances, but by their own emotional blindness. The research is clear. People with high emotional intelligence earn more money, have better relationships, experience less stress, and report higher levels of life satisfaction. They're more likely to be promoted, less likely to be divorced, and significantly more resilient in the face of challenges. Emotional intelligence is a better predictor of success than IQ, talent, or even work ethic. Yet, despite this overwhelming evidence, emotional intelligence remains the most neglected skill in human development. Most people spend more time learning to use their smartphone than they do learning to understand their own emotional system. They can tell you every feature of their favorite app, but they can't tell you what triggers their anxiety or what specific conditions they need to feel genuinely motivated. This epidemic of emotional ignorance isn't just a personal problem. It's a societal crisis. Emotionally unaware people make emotionally reactive decisions. They vote based on fear rather than wisdom. They parent from their own unhealed wounds. They lead organizations from their unconscious biases. They create products and policies that reflect their emotional limitations rather than human needs. But here's what the 1% understand that everyone else misses. Emotional intelligence isn't a soft skill. It's the foundation of all human effectiveness. It's not about being touchy-feely or emotionally expressive. It's about having accurate emotional data to make better decisions. It's about understanding the emotional operating system that drives human behavior. It's about developing the emotional skills to navigate complexity, influence others, and create the results you want in every area of life. The people who master emotional intelligence don't just feel better about themselves, they become more powerful. They can read situations more accurately, influence others more effectively, and respond to challenges with clarity instead of reactivity. They turn their emotions into competitive advantages rather than limiting factors. Chapter 2. The Neuroscience of Self-Deception. Your brain is lying to you about yourself, and it's doing it for survival. Understanding this fundamental truth is the first step toward genuine self-awareness. The human brain didn't evolve for accuracy. It evolved for survival, and sometimes those two goals are in direct conflict. Every experience you have is filtered through multiple layers of unconscious processing before it reaches your conscious awareness. Your brain is constantly editing, interpreting, and reconstructing reality to fit your existing beliefs, protect your ego, and maintain your sense of psychological safety. By the time an emotion reaches your conscious mind, it has already been processed through a complex web of neural networks designed to keep you alive, not to give you accurate information about yourself. This is why self-perception is so unreliable. You're not getting raw emotional data. You're getting a heavily edited version of reality that your brain thinks will serve you best. The problem is that what served your survival as a child may be completely counterproductive as an adult, but your brain doesn't know the difference. It's still running the same protective programs it developed when you were young, vulnerable, and dependent on others for survival. The prefrontal cortex, your brain's executive center, doesn't fully develop until around age 25. This means that many of your core emotional patterns were established by neural networks that were designed for a completely different stage of life. Your adult brain is still running childhood software, and it's creating glitches in your emotional operating system that you mistake for personality traits or unchangeable aspects of who you are. Consider the negativity bias. Your brain is hardwired to focus on potential threats and problems. This was useful when humans lived in dangerous environments where missing a threat could mean death. But in the modern world, this same bias causes you to focus disproportionately on what's wrong rather than what's working. You might receive 10 compliments and 1 criticism. And guess which one your brain will replay for the next week? This isn't a character flaw. It's a design feature of your neural architecture, but understanding it allows you to compensate for it. When you know your brain is biased toward negativity, you can consciously look for positive evidence that your automatic systems are filtering out. You can develop practices that help you see a more balanced picture of reality. The confirmation bias works the same way. Your brain actively seeks information that confirms what you already believe about yourself and filters out information that contradicts those beliefs. If you believe you're not good at relationships, your brain will highlight every relationship difficulty and downplay every relationship success. If you believe you're not capable of achieving your goals, your brain will focus on every setback and minimize every progress you make. This creates self-fulfilling prophecies that keep you trapped in limiting beliefs about yourself. You think you're seeing evidence of your limitations, but you're actually seeing evidence of your brain's filtering system. The real you with all your capabilities and potential is being hidden from your own conscious awareness by the very organ that's supposed to help you understand yourself. The emotional memory system adds another layer of complexity. Your brain stores emotional patterns as implicit memories that can be triggered without you realizing it. A tone of voice, a facial expression, or even a particular smell can activate an emotional state from your past without you making any conscious connection. You might find yourself feeling anxious or angry or sad and have no idea why, because the trigger was processed below the level of conscious awareness. These implicit emotional memories don't fade over time the way explicit memories do. They remain as vivid and powerful as the day they were created. This means you might be responding to current situations with emotional intensity that belongs to events from years or even decades ago. You're not responding to what's actually happening now. You're responding to the echoes of what happened then. The default mode network is perhaps the most important brain system that most people know nothing about. This is the network that becomes active when your mind is at rest, and it's responsible for most of your self-referential thinking. The problem is that the default mode network has a negative bias. When left to its own devices, it tends to focus on problems, regrets, and worries. This is why your mind automatically goes to negative places when you're not actively focused on something else. It's not because you're a negative person. It's because your default neural programming is designed to scan for potential problems. But most people don't know this, so they assume their negative self-talk represents accurate self-perception. Understanding these neural realities doesn't make you a victim of your brain. It makes you the conscious programmer of your own mental software. Once you know how these systems work, you can develop specific practices to work with them rather than against them. You can learn to recognize when your brain is filtering information in ways that don't serve you. And you can develop skills to access more accurate emotional data. The key insight is this: your spontaneous thoughts and feelings about yourself are not reliable sources of self-knowledge. They're the output of unconscious processing systems that are trying to protect you, not inform you. Real self-awareness requires learning to see past these automatic patterns and developing more sophisticated ways of understanding your own emotional landscape. Chapter 3. The 5 Pillars of True Emotional Intelligence. Real emotional intelligence isn't about being nice or managing your emotions so you don't upset others. It's about developing 5 core competencies that give you mastery over the emotional dimensions of life. Most people never develop these competencies because they don't understand what they are or how they work together to create emotional mastery. The first pillar is emotional accuracy. This is your ability to identify exactly what you're feeling when you're feeling it. It sounds simple, but it's incredibly sophisticated. Most people operate with an emotional vocabulary of about 12 words. Happy, sad, angry, scared, excited, tired, stressed, frustrated, annoyed, disappointed, worried, and fine. That's like trying to be a professional painter with only 12 colors. Real emotional accuracy requires developing a nuanced emotional vocabulary that allows you to distinguish between similar but distinct emotional states. The difference between irritation, frustration, and rage. The difference between nervousness, anxiety, and panic. The difference between contentment, satisfaction, and joy. These aren't just semantic distinctions. They're different emotional states that require different responses and provide different information about your needs and circumstances. Emotional accuracy also means being able to identify mixed emotions. Most emotional experiences involve multiple feelings occurring simultaneously. You might feel excited and nervous about a new opportunity or grateful and sad about a relationship ending. People with low emotional intelligence tend to focus on only the strongest emotion and miss the subtleties that provide crucial information about the situation. The second pillar is emotional sourcing. This is your ability to understand where your emotions are actually coming from. Most people assume their emotions are direct responses to their immediate circumstances. But emotions are much more complex than that. Current emotions are often influenced by past experiences, future concerns, physical states, unconscious associations, and even seemingly unrelated factors like hunger, fatigue, or hormone levels. Emotional sourcing means being able to separate what you're feeling now from what you felt in similar situations in the past. It means recognizing when your emotional response is disproportionate to the current situation because it's being amplified by unresolved emotions from previous experiences. It means understanding how your physical state affects your emotional state and how your emotional state affects your interpretation of events. People who master emotional sourcing can maintain emotional stability even in challenging situations because they understand that their immediate emotional response might not be giving them accurate information about the current reality. They can ask themselves, is this emotion about what's happening now, or is it about something from my past? Is this emotion about this specific situation? Or is it about my general stress level? Is this emotion giving me useful information? Or is it based on outdated assumptions? The third pillar is emotional regulation. This isn't about suppressing or controlling your emotions. It's about being able to influence your emotional state when it's appropriate to do so. Emotional regulation means having multiple strategies for working with different types of emotions and knowing when to use each strategy. Sometimes the right response to an emotion is to feel it fully and let it run its course. Sometimes the right response is to use cognitive strategies to reframe the situation. Sometimes the right response is to use physical techniques to shift your state. Sometimes the right response is to take action to change your circumstances. Emotional regulation means having the skills and judgment to choose the most effective approach for each situation. Advanced emotional regulation includes the ability to consciously generate specific emotional states when they would be useful. The ability to access determination when you need to push through obstacles. The ability to access calm when you need to think clearly under pressure. The ability to access empathy when you need to connect with someone who's struggling. The ability to access confidence when you need to perform at a high level. The fourth pillar is emotional communication. This is your ability to express your emotions in ways that create understanding rather than conflict. Connection rather than distance. Most people either suppress their emotions completely or express them in ways that make situations worse. Emotional communication means being able to share your emotional experience in ways that inform others about your needs and perspective without making them defensive or overwhelmed. Emotional communication requires understanding the difference between emotional expression and emotional dumping. Emotional expression is conscious and intentional. You choose when, how, and with whom to share your emotional experience based on what would be most helpful for everyone involved. Emotional dumping is unconscious and reactive. You discharge your emotions onto others without considering the impact or the appropriateness. Effective emotional communication also means being able to receive others' emotions without taking them on as your own or trying to fix them immediately. It means being able to provide emotional support without getting emotionally overwhelmed yourself. It means being able to navigate emotional conversations in ways that deepen understanding and strengthen relationships. The fifth pillar is emotional leverage. This is your ability to use emotional intelligence to create better outcomes in all areas of life. Emotional leverage means understanding how emotions influence decision-making, motivation, creativity, productivity, and relationship dynamics. And using this understanding strategically, people with high emotional leverage know how to create emotional environments that support their goals. They know how to motivate themselves and others by connecting activities to meaningful emotions. They know how to use emotional information to make better decisions about everything from career choices to daily priorities. They know how to read the emotional dynamics in groups and influence them in positive directions. Emotional leverage also means being able to remain emotionally centered and effective even when others are emotionally reactive instead of getting pulled into other people's emotional chaos. You can maintain your own emotional stability and help create more constructive emotional environments. These 5 pillars work together to create a level of emotional mastery that most people never achieve. But they're learnable skills, not innate talents. Anyone can develop these competencies with the right understanding and consistent practice. The question is whether you're willing to do the work required to develop them. Chapter 4. The Self-Awareness Paradox. Here's the cruel irony of self-awareness. The people who need it most are the least likely to develop it, while the people who already have some degree of self-awareness are the most motivated to develop more. This creates a self-awareness paradox where the gap between emotionally intelligent and emotionally unconscious people continues to widen throughout their lives. The reason for this paradox lies in how self-awareness actually develops. Self-awareness requires the ability to observe yourself objectively, but objectivity requires some degree of emotional distance from your own experience. If you're completely caught up in your emotional patterns, you can't see them clearly enough to understand them. It's like trying to read a book while holding it against your nose. You're too close to the words to make sense of them. People with low self-awareness are typically trapped in reactive emotional states. Most of the time they experience their emotions as reality rather than as information about reality. When they feel anxious, they believe the world is threatening. When they feel angry, they believe they've been wronged. When they feel sad, they believe their situation is hopeless. They're so immersed in their emotional experience that they can't step back far enough to examine it objectively. This creates a vicious cycle. The less self-aware you are, the more emotionally reactive you become. The more emotionally reactive you become, the harder it is to develop self-awareness. You become trapped in a pattern of emotional reactivity that reinforces itself and becomes increasingly difficult to break out of. But there's another layer to this paradox. Self-awareness often reveals uncomfortable truths about ourselves that our ego would prefer to keep hidden. Most people have elaborate psychological defense mechanisms designed to protect them from seeing aspects of themselves that might challenge their self-image or force them to change. These defense mechanisms include denial, rationalization, projection, and many others. They operate automatically and unconsciously to filter out information that might be threatening to our sense of self. The problem is that these same mechanisms also filter out the information we need to develop greater self-awareness. For example, if you have an unconscious belief that you're not capable of success, your defense mechanisms will work to protect this belief by filtering out evidence of your capabilities and highlighting evidence of your limitations. You might accomplish something significant, but your brain will find ways to minimize it or attribute it to luck. You might receive positive feedback, but you'll focus on the one piece of criticism. You might have opportunities for growth, but you'll find reasons why they won't work for you. This isn't conscious self-sabotage. It's unconscious self-protection. Your brain is trying to maintain psychological coherence by ensuring that your experience matches your existing beliefs about yourself. The problem is that these beliefs were often formed when you were young and had limited information about yourself and the world. They may have been protective at one point, but they become limiting as you develop new capabilities and encounter new opportunities. Breaking through this paradox requires understanding that self-awareness is fundamentally a skill of loving detachment. You have to develop the ability to observe yourself with compassion but without identification. You have to learn to see your patterns, thoughts, and emotions as objects of awareness rather than as definitions of who you are. This is why meditation and mindfulness practices are so valuable for developing self-awareness. They train you to observe your inner experience without getting caught up in it. You learn to notice thoughts without believing them automatically. You learn to feel emotions without being overwhelmed by them. You develop what psychologists call metacognition, the ability to think about your thinking. But here's what most people miss about developing self-awareness. It's not a comfortable process. True self-awareness requires facing aspects of yourself that you've been avoiding. It requires acknowledging patterns that aren't serving you. It requires admitting when you've been wrong about yourself or about situations. It requires giving up stories about yourself that might be familiar but aren't accurate. This is why most self-awareness work is superficial. People want the benefits of self-awareness without the discomfort of honest self-examination. They want to understand themselves better, but only the parts of themselves that are easy to accept. They want to develop emotional intelligence, but only in ways that confirm their existing self-image. Real self-awareness work requires what Carl Jung called shadow work. The willingness to examine and integrate the parts of yourself that you've disowned or denied. It requires looking at your patterns of self-deception. your unconscious motivations, your unhealed wounds, and your defensive strategies. It requires acknowledging both your capabilities that you've been underestimating and your limitations that you've been denying. The people who successfully develop high levels of self-awareness are those who become curious about their own unconscious patterns rather than defensive about them. They treat their psychological blind spots as interesting mysteries to solve rather than as threats to their self-image. They develop the courage to see themselves clearly even when what they see doesn't match their preferred self-concept. This shift from defensive to curious is the key to breaking through the self-awareness paradox. Instead of asking how can I prove that I'm right about myself, you start asking what don't I know about myself that might be useful to discover. Instead of protecting your self-image, you start investigating your actual patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving. The reward for this courage is profound. People with genuine self-awareness have access to much more of their potential because they're not spending energy maintaining false beliefs about themselves. They make better decisions because they have more accurate information about their own motivations, capabilities, and limitations. They have more satisfying relationships because they understand their own patterns and can take responsibility for their impact on others. But perhaps most importantly, they develop an unshakable confidence that comes from knowing themselves accurately rather than from maintaining illusions about themselves. This is the kind of confidence that doesn't depend on external validation because it's based on honest self-knowledge rather than on wishful thinking. Chapter 5. The Emotional Mapping System. Most people navigate their emotional landscape like they're walking through a foreign city without a map. They have no systematic way to understand their emotional patterns, no reliable method for predicting their emotional responses, and no clear framework for making sense of their emotional experience. This is why they keep getting lost in the same emotional territories over and over again. The solution is to develop what I call an emotional mapping system. A comprehensive framework for understanding your unique emotional patterns, triggers, needs, and responses. Just like a geographical map shows you the terrain, landmarks, and pathways of a physical location, an emotional map shows you the terrain, landmarks, and pathways of your inner emotional world. Creating your emotional map starts with identifying your core emotional patterns. These are the recurring emotional themes that show up in different areas of your life. Most people have 3 to 5 core emotional patterns that account for the majority of their emotional experience. These patterns were typically established early in life and continue to operate largely below conscious awareness. For example, one of your core patterns might be emotional overwhelm in the face of multiple demands. This pattern might show up when you have too many work projects, too many social commitments, or too many personal responsibilities. The specific triggers might be different, but the underlying emotional response is the same. You feel overwhelmed, scattered, and unable to prioritize effectively. Another core pattern might be emotional withdrawal when criticized or judged. This pattern might show up in romantic relationships, work situations, or social contexts. Whenever you perceive criticism or judgment, you might automatically shut down emotionally, become defensive, or withdraw from the interaction. Again, the specific contexts might vary, but the emotional response pattern is consistent. Identifying these patterns requires careful observation of your emotional experience over time. You need to start paying attention not just to what you're feeling, but when you're feeling it, what triggers it, how it develops, and how it resolves. This is detective work, and it requires patience and objectivity. The most effective way to do this is through systematic emotional tracking for at least 2 weeks. Document your significant emotional experiences each day. Note what you were feeling, what was happening when you felt it, what thoughts you were having, what physical sensations you noticed, and how you responded. Look for patterns across clears throat different situations and contexts. Most people discover that their emotional life is much more predictable than they realized. They tend to have similar emotional responses to similar types of situations. They tend to get triggered by the same kinds of interactions. They tend to have the same emotional needs in different contexts. Recognizing these patterns is the first step toward being able to work with them more skillfully. Once you've identified your core emotional patterns, the next step is to map your emotional triggers. These are the specific situations, interactions, or circumstances that tend to activate your strongest emotional responses. Understanding your triggers allows you to anticipate and prepare for situations that might be emotionally challenging. But here's what most people miss. Triggers aren't random. They're connected to your fundamental emotional needs and fears. If you have a need for autonomy, you'll be triggered by situations where you feel controlled or micromanaged. If you have a fear of abandonment, you'll be triggered by situations where you perceive rejection or distance. If you have a need for recognition, you'll be triggered by situations where you feel ignored or undervalued. Mapping your triggers means understanding not just what triggers you, but why it triggers you. What need is being threatened? What fear is being activated? What value is being violated? This deeper understanding allows you to respond to triggers more skillfully rather than just reacting automatically. The third component of emotional mapping is identifying your emotional resources. These are the internal and external factors that help you maintain emotional stability and resilience. Internal resources might include specific thought patterns, breathing techniques, or visualization practices that help you stay centered. External resources might include certain people, environments, or activities that help you recharge emotionally. Understanding your emotional resources is crucial because it allows you to consciously cultivate the conditions that support your emotional well-being. Instead of leaving your emotional state to chance, you can actively create environments and practices that help you maintain optimal emotional functioning. For example, you might discover that you function best emotionally when you have adequate alone time to process your experiences. Or you might find that you need regular physical activity to maintain emotional stability. Or you might realize that certain types of music or natural environments have a powerful positive effect on your emotional state. Knowing these patterns allows you to build them into your daily routine rather than hoping they'll happen accidentally. The fourth component is mapping your emotional communication patterns. How do you typically express emotions? What emotions do you find easy to express? And what emotions do you tend to suppress? How do others typically respond to your emotional expression? What patterns of emotional communication do you fall into in different relationships? Many people have unconscious rules about which emotions are acceptable to feel and express and which aren't. These rules were often learned in childhood and may not be appropriate for adult relationships and situations. Mapping your emotional communication patterns helps you identify these unconscious rules so you can make more conscious choices about how to express your emotions. The final component of emotional mapping is understanding your emotional development edge. The areas where you have the most opportunity for growth. Everyone has emotional strengths and emotional growing edges. Your emotional growing edge might be learning to stay calm under pressure, developing greater empathy, becoming more assertive, or learning to tolerate uncertainty. Identifying your emotional development edge allows you to focus your self-development efforts on the areas that will have the greatest impact on your overall emotional intelligence. Instead of trying to improve everything at once, you can concentrate on developing the specific emotional skills that will unlock the most growth and effectiveness in your life. Creating your emotional map isn't a one-time exercise. It's an ongoing process of self-discovery and development. Your emotional patterns will evolve as you grow and change, and your map should evolve along with them. But having this systematic framework for understanding your emotional landscape will give you a level of self-knowledge that most people never develop. And it will serve as the foundation for all other aspects of emotional intelligence. Chapter 6. Mastering your emotional triggers. Your triggers are not random events that happen to you. They are predictable patterns that reveal your deepest programming. Most people experience triggers as external attacks on their peace of mind. But triggers are actually internal alarm systems that activate when specific psychological needs or fears are threatened. Understanding this distinction is the difference between being controlled by your triggers and using them as information to become more emotionally intelligent. The first step to mastering your triggers is recognizing that they exist in layers. Surface triggers are the obvious ones. The tone of voice that makes you defensive, the type of criticism that shuts you down, the specific behaviors that make you angry. But underneath every surface trigger is a deeper trigger related to your core emotional needs and fears. And underneath that is an even deeper trigger related to your fundamental beliefs about yourself, other people, and how the world works. Most people only work with surface triggers. They try to avoid situations that trigger them, or they try to control their reactions when they get triggered. But this approach keeps you trapped in a reactive cycle because you're not addressing the underlying programming that creates the trigger in the first place. For example, you might get triggered when someone interrupts you during meetings. The surface trigger is the interruption behavior. But the deeper trigger might be your need to feel heard and respected. And the deepest trigger might be a childhood belief that your voice doesn't matter unless you fight for it. Until you understand and work with all three layers, you'll keep getting triggered by interruptions, no matter how much you try to manage your reactions. The key to working with triggers effectively is learning to pause between the trigger event and your response. This pause doesn't have to be long. Even a few seconds can be enough to shift from reactive to responsive mode. But creating this pause requires training your nervous system to recognize the early warning signs of activation before you're fully triggered. Physical awareness is crucial for this. Triggers always have physical signatures that appear before the emotional reaction. Your heart rate might increase. Your breathing might become shallow. Your muscles might tense, or you might feel heat in your face or chest. Learning to recognize these early physical signs gives you a window of opportunity to intervene before you become fully reactive. During this pause, you can ask yourself three powerful questions that will shift you from reactive to analytical mode. First, what need of mine is being threatened right now? Second, what story am I telling myself about what's happening? Third, what response would be most effective given my actual goals for this situation? These questions engage your prefrontal cortex and help you move from emotional reactivity to strategic thinking. Instead of just reacting to what happened, you start thinking about what you want to create. Instead of being controlled by your automatic patterns, you start making conscious choices about how to respond. But here's what most people don't understand about triggers. They're not problems to be solved. They're information to be used. Your triggers are showing you exactly where you have opportunities for growth. They're highlighting the areas where you have unmet needs, unhealed wounds, or limiting beliefs that are ready to be examined and updated. This means that the goal isn't to become trigger-free. It's to become trigger-aware. The most emotionally intelligent people still experience triggers, but they use them as data rather than being controlled by them. They see triggers as invitations to understand themselves more deeply rather than as evidence that something is wrong with them. Advanced trigger work involves learning to track your triggers back to their origin stories. Every trigger pattern was created during a specific period of your life when you developed beliefs and strategies to protect yourself from emotional pain. Understanding the origin story helps you recognize when you're operating from outdated programming that no longer serves you. For instance, if you get triggered by any form of criticism, you might trace this back to a childhood where criticism was associated with withdrawal of love or threats to your safety. The trigger made perfect sense in that context, but now it's preventing you from receiving feedback that could help you grow. Understanding the origin story allows you to update your programming with more current and accurate information about your safety and capabilities. The ultimate mastery of triggers involves learning to transform them into sources of power. Instead of being weakened by trigger situations, you learn to use them as opportunities to demonstrate your emotional strength and wisdom. You learn to stay centered and effective even when others are trying to trigger you intentionally or unintentionally. This transformation requires developing what I call trigger immunity. Trigger immunity doesn't mean you don't notice trigger situations. It means you don't lose access to your higher capabilities when they occur. You can acknowledge that someone is behaving in a way that historically would have triggered you while simultaneously maintaining your emotional equilibrium and strategic thinking. People with trigger immunity have a tremendous advantage in all areas of life. They can navigate difficult conversations without getting defensive. They can receive criticism without taking it personally. They can deal with unreasonable people without becoming unreasonable themselves. They can maintain their vision and values even when others are trying to pull them into reactive dynamics. Chapter 7. The Science of Emotional Regulation. Emotional regulation is not about controlling your emotions. It's about developing a sophisticated relationship with your emotional experience that allows you to influence your internal state in service of your goals and values. Most people approach emotional regulation from a place of emotional warfare, trying to suppress, ignore, or override their emotions through willpower. This approach not only doesn't work, it actually makes emotional reactivity worse over time. The science of emotional regulation starts with understanding that emotions are not problems to be solved. They're information systems that are designed to help you navigate complex social and environmental situations. Every emotion you experience contains valuable data about your needs, your values, your safety, and your relationships. The goal of emotional regulation is to access this information while maintaining the ability to choose how you respond. Effective emotional regulation happens on 3 levels: physiological, cognitive, and behavioral. Most people only work on one level, which is why their regulation strategies are inconsistent and often ineffective. True emotional mastery requires developing skills on all 3 levels and learning to coordinate them strategically. Physiological regulation involves working directly with your nervous system to influence your emotional state. Your emotions are not just psychological experiences. They're full-body experiences that involve changes in heart rate, breathing patterns, muscle tension, hormone levels, and brain chemistry. Learning to work with these physiological components gives you direct access to your emotional state that doesn't require going through cognitive or behavioral strategies. The most powerful physiological regulation technique is controlled breathing. Your breath is the only part of your autonomic nervous system that you can consciously control, and it has immediate effects on your emotional state. Slow deep breathing activates your parasympathetic nervous system, which promotes calm and clear thinking. Rapid shallow breathing activates your sympathetic nervous system, which promotes alertness and energy. But here's what most people miss about breath work. Different breathing patterns create different emotional states. If you want to generate calm, use extended exhales. Breathe in for 4 counts and out for 8 counts. If you want to generate energy and focus, use balanced breathing. Breathe in for 4 counts and out for 4 counts. If you want to generate confidence and determination, use power breathing. Breathe in forcefully and exhale with control. Progressive muscle relaxation is another powerful physiological tool. Emotions create specific patterns of muscle tension throughout your body. Learning to consciously release this tension helps discharge the emotional energy and return your body to a state of equilibrium. The key is to tense and release muscle groups systematically, starting with your feet and working up to your head. Cognitive regulation involves working with your thoughts and interpretations to influence your emotional experience. Your emotions are not direct responses to events. They're responses to your interpretation of events. The same situation can create completely different emotional responses depending on how you think about it. Learning to consciously direct your interpretation process gives you tremendous influence over your emotional experience. The most effective cognitive regulation strategy is perspective flexibility. Instead of getting locked into one way of thinking about a situation, you learn to consciously generate multiple perspectives and choose the one that serves you best. If you're feeling anxious about a presentation, you can choose to focus on the opportunity to share valuable information rather than on the possibility of making mistakes. If you're feeling angry about someone's behavior, you can choose to focus on their underlying needs rather than on their annoying actions. Reframing is another powerful cognitive tool. Reframing involves finding a more empowering or useful way to think about your circumstances. If you're facing a setback, you can reframe it as a learning opportunity. If you're dealing with a difficult person, you can reframe the interaction as a chance to practice your patience and communication skills. If you're feeling overwhelmed by responsibilities, you can reframe them as opportunities to grow your capabilities. Behavioral regulation involves using your actions to influence your emotional state. Your behavior doesn't just express your emotions, it creates them. Standing tall and speaking confidently can generate feelings of confidence. Smiling can generate feelings of happiness. Moving your body can generate feelings of energy and motivation. Learning to use your behavior strategically allows you to create the emotional states that support your goals. Physical movement is one of the most underutilized emotional regulation tools. Emotions create energy that wants to be expressed through movement. When you suppress this movement, you trap the emotional energy in your body, which creates chronic tension and reactivity. Learning to discharge emotional energy through appropriate movement helps you process emotions more quickly and completely. The key to advanced emotional regulation is learning to match your regulation strategy to your specific situation and goals. Sometimes the most effective approach is to feel an emotion fully and let it run its course. Sometimes the most effective approach is to shift your state immediately using physiological or behavioral techniques. Sometimes the most effective approach is to work with your thoughts and interpretations. Emotional regulation mastery also involves developing what I call state flexibility. The ability to access different emotional states based on what would be most useful for your current situation. If you're about to have a difficult conversation, you might want to access a state of calm confidence. If you're working on a creative project, you might want to access a state of curious excitement. If you're comforting someone who's upset, you might want to access a state of warm empathy. The ultimate goal of emotional regulation is not to be emotionally flat or controlled. It's to be emotionally responsive, able to feel deeply while maintaining your capacity for wise action. People with advanced emotional regulation skills experience the full spectrum of human emotions, but they don't get hijacked by them. They can be angry without being destructive, sad without being depressed, excited without being reckless, and afraid without being paralyzed. Chapter 8. Reading the emotional climate of others. Most people are walking around broadcasting their emotional state through dozens of subtle signals that they're completely unaware of while simultaneously being completely oblivious to the emotional signals that others are sending them. This emotional blindness is one of the biggest barriers to effective relationships, successful leadership, and social influence. Learning to read the emotional climate of others gives you a massive advantage in every social situation. The foundation of reading others emotionally is understanding that emotions are full-body experiences that leak out through multiple channels simultaneously. While people can consciously control their words and even some of their facial expressions, they have much less control over their body language, vocal patterns, energy levels, and micro-expressions. Learning to read these unconscious signals gives you access to people's actual emotional experience rather than the version they're trying to present. The first level of emotional reading is physiological observation. Every emotion creates specific changes in breathing patterns, posture, muscle tension, skin color, and movement patterns. Anxiety typically shows up as shallow breathing, tense shoulders, and restless movement. Anger shows up as deeper breathing, forward-leaning posture, and controlled but intense movement. Sadness shows up as slower breathing, slumped posture, and decreased movement overall. But here's what most people miss. These physiological signals appear before the conscious emotional expression. Someone might say they're fine while their body is already showing signs of stress or frustration. Learning to read these early signals allows you to respond to people's actual emotional state rather than their stated emotional state. Vocal patterns are another rich source of emotional information. Emotions don't just affect what people say, they affect how they say it. Stress typically raises vocal pitch and increases speaking speed. Depression typically lowers vocal pitch and decreases speaking speed. Excitement increases volume and vocal variety. Anxiety creates vocal tension and hesitation patterns. The key is to establish a baseline for each person by observing their normal vocal patterns when they're in a neutral emotional state. Then noticing deviations from that baseline. If someone who typically speaks quickly starts speaking slowly or someone who typically speaks softly starts speaking loudly, these changes are giving you information about their emotional state. Facial micro-expressions provide the most accurate emotional information, but they're also the most difficult to read because they happen so quickly. Micro-expressions are brief, involuntary facial expressions that reveal true emotions before they can be consciously controlled or masked. They typically last for less than a half second, but they provide extremely accurate information about what someone is actually feeling. The 7 universal micro-expressions are happiness, sadness, anger, fear, surprise, disgust, and contempt. Learning to recognize these expressions gives you insight into people's emotional experience that goes far beyond what they're willing or able to tell you consciously. But mastering micro-expression reading requires extensive practice and training because the signals are so brief and subtle. Energy patterns are perhaps the most important but least understood aspect of emotional reading. Every person carries a distinct energetic signature that changes based on their emotional state. Some people's energy becomes heavy and dense when they're sad or depressed. Other people's energy becomes sharp and intense when they're angry or frustrated. Still, others become scattered and chaotic when they're anxious or overwhelmed. Learning to read energy patterns requires developing what I call energetic sensitivity. The ability to notice how you feel when you're around different people in different emotional states. Your own emotional system is actually picking up information about other people's emotional states. But most people dismiss these impressions as imagination or projection. The second level of emotional reading involves understanding emotional context. People's emotions are not just individual experiences. They're responses to their social and environmental context. Learning to read the emotional climate of groups, organizations, and environments gives you crucial information about the dynamics that are influencing everyone involved. Group emotional climates have their own patterns and rhythms that are distinct from individual emotions. A team might have an underlying anxiety about an upcoming deadline that affects everyone's behavior even when they're not consciously aware of it. A family might have an unspoken sadness about a loss that influences all their interactions. A company might have a pervasive fear about financial stability that creates tension in every meeting. Reading group emotional climates requires stepping back from individual interactions and noticing the overall emotional atmosphere. What emotions are being expressed? What emotions are being avoided? What emotions seem to be influencing decisions and behavior even when they're not being discussed directly? The third level of emotional reading involves understanding emotional patterns over time. Most people focus only on immediate emotional states, but the most valuable information comes from tracking emotional patterns across multiple interactions and contexts. Someone might consistently become defensive when certain topics are raised or consistently become energized when discussing specific projects or consistently become withdrawn in particular social situations. These emotional patterns reveal people's core motivations, fears, values, and needs much more accurately than any single emotional expression. Understanding someone's emotional patterns allows you to predict how they're likely to respond in different situations and adjust your approach accordingly. Advanced emotional reading also involves understanding emotional contagion, the tendency for emotions to spread from person to person through unconscious mimicry and mirror neuron activation. When you're in the presence of someone who's highly emotional, your own emotional state will be influenced by theirs unless you're consciously protecting your emotional boundaries. This creates both opportunities and challenges. On the positive side, you can consciously project emotional states that will influence others in positive directions by maintaining your own emotional stability and projecting calm confidence. You can help stabilize emotional chaos in groups and relationships. On the negative side, If you don't protect your emotional boundaries, you can be pulled into other people's emotional reactivity and lose your own emotional equilibrium. The ultimate mastery of emotional reading involves developing what I call emotional translation skills. The ability to understand what people's emotions are telling you about their needs, fears, motivations, and decision-making processes. Anger often indicates that someone's boundaries or values have been violated. Anxiety often indicates that someone feels uncertain about their ability to handle upcoming challenges. Sadness often indicates that someone has experienced or anticipates loss. Understanding these emotional translations allows you to respond to people's underlying needs rather than just their surface behaviors. Instead of getting defensive when someone is angry, you can address the boundary violation that's driving their anger. Instead of dismissing someone's anxiety, you can provide the reassurance or information they need to feel more capable. Instead of avoiding someone's sadness, you can acknowledge their loss and offer appropriate support. Chapter 9. Influence through emotional intelligence. Most people think influence is about logical arguments, persuasive techniques, or personal charisma. But the real foundation of influence is emotional intelligence. People make decisions based on emotions and then use logic to justify those decisions. Understanding this fundamental truth about human psychology gives you a massive advantage in every situation where you need to influence others' thoughts, feelings, or behaviors. The first principle of emotional influence is that you must manage your own emotional state before you can effectively influence others. If you're anxious, frustrated, or emotionally reactive, you'll unconsciously transmit that energy to others, and they'll become defensive or resistant. But if you're emotionally centered, confident, and genuinely interested in creating value for others, they'll feel that energy and be more open to your influence. This is why the most influential people focus more on their internal state than on their external techniques. They understand that influence flows from who you're being, not just what you're saying or doing before entering any influence situation. They take time to center themselves emotionally and connect with their genuine intention to serve the other person's best interests. The second principle is that effective influence requires emotional calibration, the ability to read and respond to others' emotional states in real time. Different people respond to different emotional approaches. Some people are motivated by excitement and possibility. Others are motivated by security and stability. Some people respond to logical analysis. Others respond to emotional stories and personal connection. Learning to calibrate your emotional approach to match each person's emotional preferences dramatically increases your influence effectiveness. This doesn't mean being manipulative or fake. It means being emotionally intelligent enough to communicate in ways that resonate with how the other person naturally processes information and makes decisions. Emotional calibration starts with observation. Before trying to influence someone, spend time understanding their emotional patterns. What gets them excited? What makes them nervous? What do they value most deeply? What are their core emotional needs and fears? This information tells you much more about how to influence them effectively than any demographic or personality data. The third principle is that people resist being influenced when they feel like their autonomy is being threatened, but they embrace influence when they feel like their needs are being understood and addressed. This means that the most effective influence approach is to help people get what they want rather than trying to get them to do what you want. This requires a fundamental shift in how you think about influence. Instead of asking how can I get them to do what I want, you ask what do they want and how can I help them get it in a way that also serves my goals. This approach creates win-win scenarios that feel good to everyone involved and creates long-term relationship value. The fourth principle is that emotional influence works through connection, not coercion. People are influenced by those they trust, respect, and feel understood by. Building this kind of emotional connection requires genuine interest in the other person's experience, empathy for their situation, and authenticity in your interactions with them. Emotional connection is built through active listening, empathetic responses, and genuine curiosity about the other person's perspective. When people feel truly heard and understood, they naturally become more open to your ideas and suggestions. But this must be genuine. People can sense when you're just pretending to care about their experience while actually focused on your own agenda. The fifth principle involves understanding and working with emotional decision-making patterns. Most people think they make decisions rationally. But research shows that all human decisions are fundamentally emotional. Even apparently logical decisions are based on emotional preferences that are then supported by logical reasoning. Understanding this allows you to influence by connecting your proposals to people's emotional motivations rather than just their logical interests. If someone values security, you frame your proposal in terms of how it will increase their stability and reduce their risks. If someone values achievement, you frame it in terms of how it will help them accomplish important goals. If someone values connection, you frame it in terms of how it will improve their relationships. Advanced emotional influence involves understanding and working with unconscious emotional patterns. Most people have predictable emotional triggers that influence their decisions below the level of conscious awareness. Understanding these patterns allows you to present your ideas in ways that naturally align with their unconscious decision-making processes. For example, if someone has an unconscious need to feel important, you can frame your proposal in terms of the leadership opportunity it represents. If someone has an unconscious fear of being left out, you can frame it in terms of the community and belonging it offers. If someone has an unconscious need for control, you can frame it in terms of the autonomy and choice it provides. The key to ethical emotional influence is ensuring that your influence serves the other person's genuine best interests, not just your own agenda. When you use emotional intelligence to help people make decisions that truly serve their goals and values, you're providing valuable service. When you use it to manipulate people into decisions that primarily serve your interests, you're being manipulative. The difference is in your intention and in the outcome. Ethical emotional influence creates value for everyone involved and strengthens relationships. Manipulative influence creates value for you at the expense of others and damages trust and relationships over time. The highest level of emotional influence involves becoming someone that others naturally want to follow and support. This happens when you consistently use your emotional intelligence to create value for others. When you maintain high emotional integrity in all your interactions and when you develop the emotional presence that inspires confidence and trust. People with this level of emotional influence don't have to work hard to persuade others. Their reputation for emotional wisdom and genuine care for others' well-being precedes them. Others seek out their opinions, trust their judgment, and naturally align with their vision and values. This is influence through attraction rather than persuasion, and it's the most powerful and sustainable form of influence that exists. Chapter 10. Building Unshakable Emotional Resilience. Emotional resilience is not about being tough enough to handle anything that life throws at you. It's about developing the internal resources and skills to recover quickly from emotional challenges and to maintain your effectiveness even under pressure. Most people confuse emotional resilience with emotional numbness or suppression. But true resilience actually requires greater emotional sensitivity, not less. The foundation of emotional resilience is emotional flexibility. The ability to experience the full range of human emotions without being derailed by any of them. Resilient people feel their emotions deeply, but they don't get stuck in them. They can be sad without being depressed, angry without being destructive, afraid without being paralyzed, and disappointed without being defeated. This flexibility comes from understanding that emotions are temporary experiences, not permanent states. No matter how intense an emotion feels in the moment, it will eventually change if you allow it to run its natural course. Resilient people have learned to surf their emotions rather than being swept away by them. The first pillar of emotional resilience is developing a strong emotional identity that's independent of your circumstances. Most people's emotional well-being depends entirely on external factors. What happens to them, how others treat them, whether they're succeeding or failing in their goals. This creates enormous vulnerability because you have limited control over external circumstances. Resilient people develop an internal emotional foundation that remains stable regardless of what's happening around them. This doesn't mean they don't care about external circumstances. It means they don't derive their core emotional security from them. They know who they are, what they value, and what they're capable of independent of their current situation or other people's opinions of them. Building this internal foundation requires doing the deep work of understanding your core values, developing your capabilities, and healing any emotional wounds that make you dependent on external validation for your sense of worth. It's about becoming emotionally self-sufficient, able to generate the emotional states you need from internal resources rather than external circumstances. The second pillar is developing emotional processing skills that allow you to work through difficult emotions efficiently and completely. Most people either suppress their emotions or get overwhelmed by them, both of which create emotional residue that accumulates over time and reduces resilience. Effective emotional processing involves allowing yourself to feel emotions fully while maintaining enough perspective to understand what they're telling you and what response would be most helpful. It's about having a conscious relationship with your emotional experience rather than being unconsciously controlled by it. The key to healthy emotional processing is learning to distinguish between primary and secondary emotions. Primary emotions are your direct response to what's happening. Fear about a real threat, sadness about a real loss, anger about a real violation. Secondary emotions are your response to your primary emotions, feeling guilty about being angry, feeling ashamed about being afraid, feeling anxious about being sad. Most emotional suffering comes from secondary emotions rather than primary emotions. Primary emotions are usually relatively brief and contain useful information about your situation. Secondary emotions can last indefinitely and create suffering without providing useful information. Learning to recognize and release secondary emotions dramatically improves your emotional resilience. The third pillar is building emotional endurance through gradual exposure to emotional challenges like physical fitness. Emotional resilience improves when you progressively challenge yourself with manageable levels of emotional stress. This doesn't mean seeking out trauma or unnecessary suffering. It means gradually expanding your capacity to handle emotional intensity. This can be as simple as having difficult conversations that you've been avoiding, taking calculated risks that stretch your comfort zone, or deliberately practicing emotional regulation skills in challenging situations. Each time you successfully navigate an emotional challenge, you build confidence in your ability to handle future challenges. The fourth pillar is developing a strong support system that provides both emotional connection and practical assistance during difficult times. Resilience is not a solo project. It's built through relationships with people who understand you, believe in you, and are willing to support you when you're struggling. But building a support system requires being willing to be vulnerable with others about your emotional experience. Many people are reluctant to reach out for support because they're afraid of being seen as weak or burdensome. But research shows that people who can ask for and receive emotional support recover from setbacks much faster than those who try to handle everything alone. The fifth pillar is maintaining physical practices that support emotional resilience. Your emotional state is intimately connected to your physical state. Regular exercise, adequate sleep, proper nutrition, and stress management practices all contribute to your ability to handle emotional challenges effectively. Physical practices also provide concrete ways to discharge emotional energy and regulate your nervous system. When you're emotionally activated, physical movement helps process the energy rather than letting it build up as chronic tension. When you're emotionally depleted, rest and restoration help rebuild your emotional resources. The sixth pillar is developing meaning-making frameworks that help you find purpose and growth in difficult experiences. Resilient people don't just survive challenges. They use them as catalysts for growth and development. They have frameworks for understanding adversity as information, obstacles as opportunities, and setbacks as setups for comebacks. This doesn't mean being naive about genuine difficulties or pretending that bad things are actually good. It means developing the cognitive and emotional skills to extract value from difficult experiences and use them to become stronger, wiser, and more capable. The ultimate goal of emotional resilience is not to become invulnerable to emotional pain, but to develop such confidence in your ability to handle whatever life brings that you stop limiting yourself out of fear of emotional discomfort. When you know you can handle anything emotionally, you become free to take the risks, pursue the relationships, and chase the dreams that will create the life you really want. Resilient people don't experience less emotional pain than others. They experience it more skillfully. They feel their emotions fully, process them effectively, learn from them quickly, and return to emotional equilibrium faster. This allows them to engage more fully with life because they're not constantly protecting themselves from potential emotional pain. Building emotional resilience is a lifelong practice, not a destination. There's always more capacity to develop, always new emotional challenges that will stretch your capabilities, and always opportunities to deepen your emotional wisdom. But every step you take in building your emotional resilience makes you more capable of creating the life you want and helping others do the same. Chapter 11. Emotional Intelligence in Relationships. Most people think good relationships happen when you find the right person. But the truth is that good relationships happen when you become the right person. Your level of emotional intelligence determines the quality of every relationship in your life. And most people are unconsciously sabotaging their relationships because they lack the emotional skills to navigate human connection successfully. The foundation of relationship emotional intelligence is understanding that every interaction is an emotional exchange. You're constantly giving and receiving emotional energy, and the quality of this exchange determines whether relationships grow stronger or weaker over time. Most people are unconscious of this exchange, which means they're accidentally creating negative emotional experiences for others without realizing it. The first principle of relationship emotional intelligence is emotional responsibility. This means taking full ownership of the emotional impact you have on others. Regardless of your intentions, most people focus on what they meant to communicate rather than what they actually communicated. But in relationships, impact matters more than intention. Emotional responsibility requires developing the awareness to notice how your emotional state affects others. If you're stressed, anxious, or frustrated, that energy transmits to the people around you and influences their emotional experience. If you're calm, confident, and genuinely interested in others, that energy also transmits and creates positive emotional experiences. This doesn't mean you have to be artificially positive or suppress your authentic emotions. It means being conscious of your emotional state and taking responsibility for managing it in ways that serve your relationships rather than damage them. If you're going through a difficult time, you can be honest about that without dumping your emotional chaos onto others. The second principle is emotional attunement. The ability to accurately sense and respond to others' emotional states. Most people are so focused on their own emotional experience that they miss the subtle emotional signals that others are constantly sending. This creates disconnection and misunderstanding even in close relationships. Emotional attunement requires developing the sensitivity to notice changes in others' energy, mood, and emotional needs. It means paying attention to what's not being said as much as what is being said. It means recognizing when someone needs emotional support, space, encouragement, or simply to be heard without being fixed or advised. But here's what most people miss about emotional attunement. It's not about becoming emotionally responsible for others' feelings. It's about being responsive to their emotional experience. The difference is crucial. Emotional responsibility for others creates codependency and resentment. Emotional responsiveness creates connection and intimacy. The third principle is emotional boundaries. Many people confuse emotional intelligence with having no emotional boundaries. But the opposite is true. Healthy emotional boundaries are essential for maintaining your emotional well-being while still being emotionally available to others. Emotional boundaries mean knowing where your emotions end and others' emotions begin. It means being able to empathize with someone's pain without taking on their pain as your own. It means being supportive without becoming emotionally inched. It means caring without caretaking. People who lack emotional boundaries often become emotional sponges, absorbing everyone else's emotional states and losing touch with their own emotional needs. They think they're being loving and supportive, but they're actually creating unhealthy relationship dynamics where others become dependent on them for emotional regulation. The fourth principle is emotional communication mastery. This goes far beyond just expressing your emotions clearly. It involves understanding how to share your emotional experience in ways that create intimacy rather than distance, understanding rather than defensiveness, and resolution rather than conflict. Emotional communication mastery requires understanding the difference between emotional expression and emotional dumping. Emotional expression is conscious, intentional, and considerate of the other person's capacity to receive what you're sharing. Emotional dumping is unconscious, reactive, and overwhelming for the other person. Effective emotional communication also involves learning to receive others' emotions without immediately trying to fix, change, or minimize them. Most people are uncomfortable with others' difficult emotions and rush to offer solutions or reassurances that actually shut down emotional connection. Learning to be present with others' emotions without needing to change them is one of the most powerful relationship skills you can develop. The fifth principle is conflict transformation. Every relationship will have conflict, but emotionally intelligent people use conflict as an opportunity to deepen understanding and strengthen connection rather than as a battle to be won or avoided. Conflict transformation requires understanding that most relationship conflicts are not about the surface issue being argued about. They're about underlying emotional needs that aren't being met. Someone who gets angry about dishes not being done isn't really angry about dishes. They're feeling unappreciated or unsupported. Someone who gets defensive about being late isn't really defending their time management. They're feeling criticized or controlled. Learning to identify and address the underlying emotional dynamics transforms conflict from destructive to constructive. Instead of arguing about the symptoms, you address the actual needs and fears that are driving the conflict. This creates solutions that actually resolve the underlying tension rather than just temporarily suppressing it. Advanced relationship, emotional intelligence involves understanding and working with attachment styles. Everyone has unconscious patterns of how they form and maintain emotional bonds with others. And these patterns were largely established in childhood based on early caregiving experiences. People with secure attachment styles find it relatively easy to form close relationships and maintain emotional intimacy. People with anxious attachment styles tend to worry about abandonment and may become clingy or demanding in relationships. People with avoidant attachment styles tend to be uncomfortable with emotional closeness and may withdraw when relationships become too intimate. Understanding your own attachment style and recognizing others' attachment styles allows you to navigate relationships with much greater skill and compassion. You can recognize when someone's behavior is coming from attachment insecurity rather than taking it personally. You can adjust your approach to provide the specific type of reassurance or space that different attachment styles need. The ultimate goal of relationship emotional intelligence is creating what researchers call secure functioning relationships. These are relationships where both people feel emotionally safe to be fully authentic, where conflicts are resolved in ways that strengthen rather than weaken the bond, and where each person's individual growth is supported rather than threatened by the relationship. Secure functioning relationships don't happen accidentally. They're created by people who have developed the emotional intelligence to navigate the complex dynamics of human connection skillfully. They require ongoing attention, conscious effort, and continued growth in emotional awareness and skill. But the reward is profound. People who master relationship emotional intelligence experience deeper intimacy, more satisfying connections, and more resilient relationships that can weather the inevitable challenges of life. They become people that others feel safe to be vulnerable with, which creates the foundation for truly meaningful human connection. Chapter 12. Emotional Intelligence in Leadership and Influence. The most powerful leaders in history were not necessarily the smartest, the most charismatic, or even the most skilled in their particular field. They were the ones who understood how to work with the emotional dimensions of human motivation and behavior. Emotional intelligence is not just helpful for leadership. It's the foundation of all effective leadership. Traditional leadership models focus on strategy, vision, and execution. But they miss the fundamental reality that all human behavior is emotionally driven. People don't follow leaders because of their logical arguments or strategic brilliance. They follow leaders who make them feel capable, valued, and inspired. They follow leaders who understand their emotional needs and can create emotional environments that bring out their best performance. The first pillar of emotionally intelligent leadership is emotional modeling. As a leader, your emotional state becomes the emotional thermostat for your entire team or organization. If you're anxious, that anxiety spreads throughout your team. If you're confident and calm under pressure, that stability spreads as well. Most leaders are unconscious of this dynamic and accidentally create emotional climates that undermine their team's effectiveness. Emotional modeling requires developing the ability to consciously manage your own emotional state. Not because you don't feel difficult emotions, but because you understand that your emotions have exponential impact on others. It means learning to process your own emotional challenges privately rather than working through them publicly in ways that create anxiety or uncertainty for your team. But emotional modeling goes beyond just managing negative emotions. The most effective leaders actively cultivate and project the emotional states that they want to see in their team. If you want your team to be innovative, you model curiosity and creative risk-taking. If you want them to be resilient, you model calm confidence in the face of setbacks. If you want them to be collaborative, you model genuine interest in others' perspectives. The second pillar is emotional reading at scale. While individual emotional intelligence involves reading one person at a time, leadership emotional intelligence requires reading the emotional climate of groups, teams, and entire organizations. Groups have their own emotional patterns that are distinct from the sum of individual emotions. A team might have collective anxiety about an upcoming deadline, shared excitement about a new opportunity, or underlying resentment about a previous decision. These collective emotional states powerfully influence performance, decision-making, and collaboration. But most leaders are either unaware of them or don't know how to work with them effectively. Reading group emotional climates requires developing sensitivity to energy shifts, paying attention to what's not being said, noticing patterns in behavior and communication, and understanding how historical events continue to influence current emotional dynamics. It means recognizing that logical discussions often mask underlying emotional concerns that need to be addressed before real progress can be made. The third pillar is motivational emotional intelligence. Different people are motivated by different emotional experiences, and effective leaders learn to connect tasks and goals to the specific emotional rewards that motivate each individual. Some people are motivated by achievement and recognition. Others are motivated by connection and belonging. Still, others are motivated by autonomy and mastery. Generic motivational approaches fail because they assume everyone is motivated by the same emotional rewards. Emotionally intelligent leaders take time to understand each person's unique motivational profile and find ways to connect their responsibilities to their core emotional drivers. This requires moving beyond surface-level motivational techniques to understanding people's deeper emotional needs and values. It means having conversations about what work feels meaningful, what types of recognition feel valuable, what kinds of challenges feel energizing rather than overwhelming, and what environmental factors support their best performance. The fourth pillar is influence through emotional alignment. The most persuasive leaders don't try to convince people through logical arguments alone. They understand that people make decisions emotionally and then use logic to justify those decisions. Effective influence requires connecting your vision and goals to people's existing emotional motivations and values. This means learning to frame opportunities, challenges, and requests in terms of the emotional outcomes that matter to your audience. If you're working with someone who values security, you emphasize how your proposal reduces risk and increases stability. If you're working with someone who values growth, you emphasize the learning and development opportunities. If you're working with someone who values impact, you emphasize the meaningful difference they can make. Emotional alignment also requires understanding and working with resistance. When people resist your leadership or ideas, the resistance is usually emotional, not logical. They may have concerns about their capability, fears about change, or values that feel threatened by what you're proposing. Addressing the emotional source of resistance is much more effective than trying to overcome it with more logical arguments. The fifth pillar is creating psychologically safe environments where people can perform at their highest level. Psychological safety is the feeling that you can be authentic, take risks, ask questions, and make mistakes without fear of negative consequences to your status or career. Research shows that psychological safety is the strongest predictor of team performance across all industries and contexts. Creating psychological safety requires emotional intelligence because it's fundamentally about managing the emotional climate of your team or organization. It means responding to mistakes with curiosity rather than criticism. It means encouraging questions and dissenting opinions rather than demanding conformity. It means supporting people through challenges rather than withdrawing support when they struggle. But creating psychological safety doesn't mean avoiding difficult conversations or lowering performance standards. It means having those conversations in ways that feel supportive rather than threatening, and maintaining high standards while providing the emotional support that helps people reach those standards. The sixth pillar is navigating organizational politics with emotional intelligence. Every organization has complex webs of relationships, competing interests, and informal power structures that operate largely through emotional dynamics. Leaders who try to navigate these dynamics through logic alone often find themselves isolated or ineffective. Emotionally intelligent leaders understand that organizational politics are fundamentally about human emotions. Pride, fear, ambition, loyalty, resentment, and hope. They learn to read these emotional undercurrents and work with them skillfully rather than trying to ignore them or wish them away. This doesn't mean being manipulative or playing political games. It means understanding the emotional needs and concerns of different stakeholders and finding ways to address them while still achieving your organizational goals. It means building genuine relationships based on mutual respect and shared values rather than trying to control outcomes through force or manipulation. The ultimate goal of emotionally intelligent leadership is creating environments where people consistently perform at their highest level because they feel emotionally supported, intellectually challenged, and personally valued. This creates sustainable high performance that doesn't depend on external pressure or artificial motivation. Leaders who master emotional intelligence don't have to work hard to get people to follow them. People naturally want to work for and with them because they feel better about themselves and their capabilities when they're in their presence. This is leadership through inspiration rather than intimidation. And it's the only type of leadership that creates lasting positive change. Chapter 13. Developing Emotional Intuition. Beyond the systematic skills of emotional intelligence lies something more subtle but equally powerful. Emotional intuition. This is your ability to sense emotional information that exists below the threshold of conscious awareness, to pick up on patterns and dynamics that your logical mind hasn't yet processed, and to access wisdom about emotional situations that comes from deeper levels of perception than analytical thinking. Most people dismiss emotional intuition as unscientific or unreliable. But research shows that our unconscious mind processes emotional information much faster and more comprehensively than our conscious mind. Your brain is constantly picking up micro-expressions, vocal patterns, energy shifts, and contextual cues that provide rich information about emotional dynamics. But most of this processing happens below conscious awareness. Emotional intuition is your ability to access this unconscious processing and translate it into conscious understanding. It's the feeling you get that something is off in a conversation even when you can't identify exactly what it is. It's the sense that someone is struggling emotionally even when they're saying everything is fine. It's the recognition that a group dynamic is shifting even before the shift becomes obvious to everyone else. The first step in developing emotional intuition is learning to distinguish between intuitive information and emotional projection. Projection happens when you assume others are feeling what you're feeling, or when you interpret their behavior through the lens of your own emotional patterns. Intuition happens when you pick up actual information about others' emotional states that's independent of your own emotional experience. The key difference is that projection feels emotionally charged and personally relevant, while intuition feels neutral and formational. If you sense that someone is angry and it triggers your own anxiety or defensiveness, that's likely projection. If you sense that someone is angry and it feels like neutral information that allows you to respond more skillfully, that's likely intuition. Developing this distinction requires developing what I call emotional neutrality. The ability to perceive emotional information without becoming emotionally reactive to it. This doesn't mean becoming emotionally numb. It means developing enough emotional stability that you can sense what's happening emotionally around you without being pulled into reactive patterns. The second step is learning to recognize the physical signatures of emotional intuition. Intuitive information usually comes through subtle physical sensations rather than through thoughts or logical analysis. You might feel a tightness in your chest when someone is being inauthentic, a heaviness in your stomach when someone is depressed, or a restless energy when someone is anxious. These physical sensations are your nervous system picking up and translating emotional information from your environment. Learning to recognize and interpret these signals requires developing body awareness, and learning to trust physical information that doesn't have obvious logical explanations. But here's what most people miss about emotional intuition. It requires slowing down and creating space for subtle perception. In our fast-paced, cognitively focused culture, most people are moving too quickly and thinking too much to pick up subtle emotional information. Emotional intuition emerges in moments of stillness, presence, and receptive awareness. This means that developing emotional intuition requires cultivating practices that quiet your mental activity and increase your present moment awareness. This might include meditation, mindfulness practices, time in nature, or any activity that helps you shift from analytical thinking to receptive awareness. The third step is learning to work with emotional resonance. This is the tendency for your own emotional system to mirror and amplify the emotional states of others. When you're around someone who's anxious, you might start feeling anxious yourself. When you're around someone who's depressed, you might start feeling heavy and low energy. Most people try to avoid emotional resonance because it can be uncomfortable. But it's actually one of your most powerful sources of emotional information. Learning to allow temporary emotional resonance while maintaining enough emotional boundaries to avoid getting stuck in others' emotional states gives you incredible insight into what others are experiencing. This requires developing what I call permeable boundaries. The ability to open yourself to others' emotional experience when it's useful, while maintaining the ability to return to your own emotional center when you're done gathering information. It's like being a tuning fork that can pick up and amplify different frequencies without permanently changing its own resonant frequency. The fourth step is developing pattern recognition for emotional dynamics. Over time, as you pay attention to emotional information, you'll start recognizing patterns that repeat across different people and situations. You'll notice that certain types of emotional dynamics tend to unfold in predictable ways, that certain emotional states tend to lead to certain behaviors, and that certain interventions tend to shift emotional dynamics in positive directions. This pattern recognition allows you to respond more skillfully to emotional situations because you can recognize what's happening and where it's likely to lead. Instead of just reacting to immediate emotional information, you can respond based on your understanding of how these patterns typically develop and resolve. Advanced emotional intuition involves learning to sense the emotional potential in situations. Not just what's happening emotionally now, but what could happen under clear's throat different conditions. You might sense that a team has the potential for much greater collaboration if certain emotional barriers were addressed. You might recognize that a relationship could become much more intimate if both people felt safer being vulnerable. This requires developing what I call emotional imagination. The ability to envision how emotional dynamics could shift under different circumstances. This isn't wishful thinking or projection. It's based on understanding the emotional factors that are currently limiting potential and recognizing what might be possible if those factors changed. The ultimate goal of emotional intuition is not to become psychic or to read minds, but to develop such sensitivity to emotional information that you can navigate complex emotional situations with grace and effectiveness. It's about becoming someone who others feel understood by, who can sense what's needed in emotionally challenging moments, and who can help create emotional environments that bring out the best in everyone involved. Emotional intuition is both an art and a science. The science involves understanding how emotional information is transmitted and received. The art involves developing the sensitivity and wisdom to work with this information in ways that serve everyone's highest good. Together, they create a level of emotional mastery that transforms not only your own life, but your ability to positively influence the lives of others. Chapter 14. The Dark Side of Emotional Intelligence. Emotional intelligence is not inherently good or bad. It's a set of skills that can be used for constructive or destructive purposes. Just like physical strength can be used to help people or hurt them, emotional intelligence can be used to create positive outcomes or to manipulate and control others. Understanding the dark side of emotional intelligence is crucial for developing ethical emotional skills and protecting yourself from those who might use these skills against you. The first dark side pattern is emotional manipulation. People with high emotional intelligence understand how emotions influence behavior. And some use this knowledge to manipulate others into doing what they want rather than what serves the other person's best interests. They know which emotional buttons to push to get specific responses, and they use this knowledge strategically for their own benefit. Emotional manipulation often looks like authentic emotional intelligence on the surface. The manipulator might seem empathetic, understanding, and emotionally supportive, but if you pay attention to the outcomes, you'll notice that interactions consistently benefit the manipulator more than they benefit you. They use emotional connection to gain trust, then leverage that trust to get what they want. The key to recognizing emotional manipulation is paying attention to how you feel during and after interactions with someone. Authentic emotional intelligence creates mutual benefit and leaves everyone feeling better about themselves and the relationship. Emotional manipulation creates one-sided benefit and often leaves you feeling confused, depleted, or subtly coerced. The second dark side pattern is emotional exploitation. This happens when someone uses their emotional intelligence to identify and exploit others' emotional vulnerabilities. They might prey on someone's need for approval, fear of abandonment, or desire for connection to get them to make decisions that serve the explosive's agenda. Emotional exploitation often targets people who are emotionally needy, insecure, or going through difficult life transitions when their emotional defenses are down. The explorer presents themselves as emotionally supportive while actually taking advantage of the other person's emotional vulnerability. Protecting yourself from emotional exploitation requires developing strong emotional boundaries and a clear sense of your own values and interests. You need to be able to distinguish between genuine emotional support and support that comes with hidden strings attached. You need to be willing to walk away from relationships or situations where your emotional needs are being used against you. The third dark side pattern is narcissistic emotional intelligence. Some people develop sophisticated emotional skills not to connect authentically with others but to maintain their own ego and get the admiration and attention they crave. They become expert at reading what others want to hear and presenting themselves in ways that generate positive responses. Narcissistic emotional intelligence can be very seductive because these individuals often seem extremely charming, understanding, and emotionally sophisticated. But their emotional attunement is entirely self-serving. They're not actually interested in your emotional experience except as it relates to their own needs for validation and control. The key to recognizing narcissistic emotional intelligence is noticing whether the person shows genuine interest in your experience when it doesn't directly benefit them. Do they remember details about your life that aren't relevant to their own interests? Do they provide emotional support when you need it, but they don't get anything from it? Do they acknowledge their own emotional mistakes and limitations? The fourth dark side pattern is emotional enabling. This happens when someone uses their emotional intelligence to help others avoid necessary growth and change. They might be so good at providing emotional comfort and support that they inadvertently prevent others from developing their own emotional skills and resilience. Emotional enabling often comes from good intentions, the desire to protect others from emotional pain. But it creates dependency relationships where the other person doesn't develop their own emotional intelligence because they rely on someone else to provide emotional regulation and support. The most common form of emotional enabling is rescuing others from the natural consequences of their emotional choices. Instead of allowing someone to learn from their emotional mistakes, the enabler swoops in to fix the situation or provide comfort that prevents learning from occurring. The fifth dark side pattern is emotional perfectionism. Some people become so focused on managing emotions correctly that they lose touch with the natural, messy, imperfect reality of human emotional experience. They try to control their own emotions and others' emotions to avoid any discomfort or conflict. Emotional perfectionism creates artificial, sterile relationships where genuine emotional expression is suppressed in favor of maintaining emotional harmony. It prevents the kind of authentic emotional exchanges that create real intimacy and connection. The antidote to emotional perfectionism is developing tolerance for emotional messiness and conflict. Real emotional intelligence includes the ability to navigate difficult emotions and challenging conversations, not just the ability to maintain artificial emotional peace. The sixth dark side pattern is emotional bypass. This happens when someone uses emotional intelligence concepts to avoid dealing with practical realities or taking necessary action. They might focus so much on processing emotions and creating emotional understanding that they never address the actual problems that need to be solved. Emotional bypass often looks like wisdom and emotional sophistication, but it's actually a form of avoidance. Instead of taking action to change problematic situations, the person endlessly processes the emotions around the situation without ever addressing the underlying causes. The key to avoiding emotional bypass is maintaining balance between emotional processing and practical action. Emotions provide valuable information, but they're not the only information you need to make good decisions and create positive change in your life. Understanding these dark side patterns doesn't mean becoming cynical about emotional intelligence or suspicious of emotionally intelligent people. Most people who develop emotional intelligence use it constructively and ethically. But understanding the potential for misuse helps you develop discernment about when and how to trust emotional information both from yourself and from others. The ultimate protection against the dark side of emotional intelligence is developing your own emotional intelligence to a high level. When you understand how emotions work and how emotional skills can be used, you're much less likely to be manipulated or exploited. You can recognize authentic emotional connection versus artificial emotional performance. You can distinguish between support that serves your growth and support that keeps you dependent. Most importantly, you can commit to using your own emotional intelligence in ways that serve everyone's highest good rather than just your own immediate interests. Ethical emotional intelligence creates win-win outcomes where everyone benefits from emotional interactions. It builds trust, creates genuine connection, and contributes to the emotional well-being of everyone involved. Chapter 15. The Complete Transformation. Everything you've learned in this journey through emotional intelligence means nothing unless you actually implement it. Most people consume information about self-improvement, like entertainment. They enjoy learning about it. They feel temporarily inspired, but they never do the work required to actually transform their emotional reality. Don't be one of these people. Real transformation happens through consistent daily practice, not through one-time insights or motivational moments. Emotional intelligence is like physical fitness. It requires ongoing effort to develop and maintain. You can't go to the gym once and expect to be physically fit for life. And you can't read about emotional intelligence once and expect to be emotionally intelligent forever. The first phase of your transformation involves establishing foundational practices that will support your emotional development over time. This means creating daily habits that increase your emotional awareness, improve your emotional regulation skills, and strengthen your ability to read and respond to others' emotions effectively. Start with a daily emotional check-in practice. Set aside 5 minutes each morning to assess your current emotional state. Identify any emotional patterns you want to be aware of during the day. And set an intention for how you want to show up emotionally. End each day with a brief review of your emotional experiences, noting what you handled well and what you want to improve. Develop a regular mindfulness or meditation practice that helps you observe your thoughts and emotions without being controlled by them. This doesn't have to be complicated. Even 10 minutes of focused breathing or body awareness each day will significantly improve your emotional intelligence over time. Create triggers throughout your day to remind yourself to pause and assess the emotional climate around you. This might be every time you enter a new environment, before important conversations, or whenever you notice emotional reactivity in yourself or others. The second phase involves deliberately practicing your emotional intelligence skills in low-stakes situations before applying them in high-stakes contexts. This is like practicing scales before performing a concert. You need to develop fluency with basic emotional skills before you can use them effectively in challenging situations. Practice reading emotional signals by people watching in public places. Observe body language, facial expressions, vocal patterns, and energy levels. Try to guess what people might be feeling and then notice whether their subsequent behavior confirms or contradicts your impressions. Practice emotional regulation techniques when you're experiencing mild emotions rather than waiting until you're overwhelmed. Use breathing techniques when you're slightly stressed. Practice reframing when you're mildly disappointed and experiment with different approaches to see what works best for you. Practice emotional communication by having low-stakes emotional conversations with friends or family members. Share something you're feeling in a clear, non-reactive way and notice how it affects the quality of your connection. The third phase involves applying your emotional intelligence skills in increasingly challenging situations. This is where you develop the confidence and competence to use emotional intelligence when it really matters in difficult conversations, high-pressure situations, and complex relationship dynamics. Start by identifying one area of your life where improved emotional intelligence would make the biggest difference. This might be a specific relationship, work situation, or personal challenge. Focus your practice efforts on developing the specific emotional skills that would be most valuable in that context. Gradually expand your practice to include more challenging situations and relationships. Each time you successfully apply emotional intelligence skills in a difficult situation, you build confidence in your ability to handle future challenges. The fourth phase involves teaching and mentoring others in emotional intelligence. This is not just about helping others. Teaching emotional intelligence to others dramatically accelerates your own development. When you have to explain these concepts and help others apply them, you deepen your own understanding and identify areas where you need continued growth. Look for opportunities to share what you've learned with people who are interested in developing their emotional intelligence. This might be formal teaching or mentoring, or it might be informal support and guidance for friends, family members, or colleagues. Remember that teaching emotional intelligence requires modeling it consistently. People learn more from watching how you handle emotional situations than from listening to what you say about emotions. Your behavior becomes your teaching. So, make sure you're demonstrating the emotional skills you want others to develop. The fifth and final phase is integration. Making emotional intelligence such a natural part of who you are that you don't have to think about it consciously. At this level, emotional intelligence becomes automatic. You naturally notice emotional dynamics, Regulate your own emotions effectively and respond to others in emotionally intelligent ways without having to consciously apply techniques. This level of integration takes years of consistent practice, but it's worth every moment of effort. When emotional intelligence becomes second nature, you operate from a completely different level of effectiveness in all areas of life. Your relationships become deeper and more satisfying. Your work becomes more impactful and fulfilling. Your personal resilience becomes unshakable. But integration doesn't mean you stop growing. Even master-level emotional intelligence can be refined and deepened throughout your lifetime. There are always new emotional challenges that will stretch your capabilities, new relationships that will require different emotional skills and new levels of emotional wisdom to discover. The journey of emotional intelligence is not a destination you reach. It's a way of life you choose. Every day you get to decide whether you'll operate from emotional unconsciousness or emotional wisdom. Every interaction is an opportunity to practice emotional intelligence. Every challenge is a chance to deepen your emotional capabilities. Most people will never take this journey. They'll continue living as prisoners of their unconscious emotional patterns, wondering why they can't create the life and relationships they want. But you have the knowledge and tools to choose a different path. The question is, will you actually use them? Will you do the daily work required to transform your emotional reality? Will you persist through the inevitable challenges and setbacks that come with any significant change? Will you commit to becoming the emotionally intelligent person you're capable of being? Your emotional intelligence doesn't just affect you. It affects everyone whose life you touch. When you develop emotional wisdom, you become a source of emotional stability and growth for others. You help create emotional environments where people can thrive. You model what's possible when someone commits to emotional mastery. This is bigger than personal development. This is about contributing to a more emotionally intelligent world where people understand themselves and each other more deeply, where conflicts are resolved through emotional wisdom rather than emotional reactivity, and where human potential can be fully realized. The transformation starts now, not tomorrow, not next week, not when you have more time or motivation. Now your emotionally intelligent life is waiting for you to claim it.